let's get started. Hopefully some other folks join us in the next couple minutes before we really jump in. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Sandy Fox. I am a digital strategy and mobile consultant. I've been running Smart as a Fox, which is my consulting firm, for 4 years. But before that, I was in-house at multiple nonprofits, including Planned Parenthood, where I started their mobile program. Since then, I have started Vote.org's broadcast mobile program. I've worked with organizations like the SEIU, State Voices, as well as plenty of others. I can't even list them all off the top of my head right now. And right now I'm working directly with Hip Hop Caucus and Save the Children and running their mobile programs. I do a lot of training. So some of you may have attended one of my trainings in the past on specifically mobile strategy, content, as well as texting compliance and deliverability. So a lot of people know me through my trainings and through my through mobile and within the progressive space. We're going to cover a lot today, namely 10DLC, which I know is an ongoing question for a lot of folks. It's still an ongoing question because everything keeps changing and it's being rolled out very slowly / fast, and they keep changing the rules. So that's why this training is pretty important. So what are we going to cover today? First, we're going to cover the basics. We're going to go over some key terms, talk about peer-to-peer versus broadcast texting, and I'm going to go over that pretty quickly. And then we're going to go into compliance, and that's where we're going to dig in a little more to 10DLC. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about deliverability and making sure that your messages are actually delivered to your audiences, because we don't like spending money sending texts that are not being received, right? So we're going to cover all of that as well. At the end of each section, I'm going to ask if there are any questions, and I ask that you place those questions in the chat. You could do that while I'm talking, so if you are afraid you're going to forget your question, you can put those in the chat, and feel free, and then I'll go back, or the Netroots volunteer who's helping me will remind me of questions that I may have missed. Okay. So let's get going. So let's talk about the basics. First of all, very, very straightforward. SMS, right? SMS stands for short message service. This is literally 160 characters. You can send a message that is longer than 160 characters, but if it is an SMS, it'll be broken up into segments. So if you send a message that is 200 characters, it will be broken up into 2 SMS segments when you send it, which is why we like to try to keep our messages short, both for a combination of cost reasons and also because some of the carriers have gotten better at this, but not all. Basically, sometimes those segments come in the wrong order. So if you send a really long message that's 3 segments, they might come in the wrong order, and it can be a very jarbled and confusing message for the person who is receiving it. So we try to avoid that. Now, SMS costs a lot less than our next option, which is MMS. MMS stands for Multimedia Message Service. This allows you to send images and GIFs, but also longer messages that aren't broken out into those segments. So it is really ideal for that kind of engagement when you do want to send a bit of a longer message. Both allow for clickable links, and also MMS tends to be about 3 times more expensive, if not more, than an SMS message. So you're paying a bit of a premium for having that graphic or GIF or that longer message without it being broken up for sure. Now, message delivery. For those messages, there are 3 different ways you can deliver that message. You can use a long code, also now known as 10DLC or 10-digit long code, which is the full out name, which is basically a local phone number, right? A lot of folks like to use this for peer-to-peer texting because you can select your area code that is local to the place that you are texting. Then you have toll-free. And toll free also 10-digit number, but as you know, it's usually an 800-866. It also, you don't have to worry about, the charges if it's going through necessarily. It looks a little more official. So toll free is also another option to send these messages. And lastly is Shortcode. This is the more expensive option. And with all of these, there is an application process. But Shortcode is the most rigorous. And you get a 5 to 6 digit number. The main reason people use Shortcode is a couple of key reasons. Number one, you use Shortcode because it's really an easy number to remember, right? So if you're doing promotional digital ads or want to promote an event, you can tell someone to text vote to 666-539, right? And so people are more likely to remember that. If you're, advertising it at a rally or putting it on a ad, people can easily then text that to opt in or to do the action you want them to take. Also with Shortcode, you can send more messages per minute, which is something called throughput, which we're going to talk about in a little bit. So you can, if you have a larger list, Shortcode is more ideal. Now, Shortcodes can cost between $500 and $1,000 a month. Plus there are setup costs. So it is comparatively to long code and toll free, which are more in the like $62 range, depending per month. Shortcode is definitely a lot more expensive, but there again are benefits to it. And toll free, you can now do higher throughput, which is why you might spend $100 or $60 or $200 to be able to send more messages per minute. So those are your message delivery options. But I'm happy to answer additional questions about that in a bit. Next, we're going to talk a little bit about warm versus cold texting. Do you folks here know the difference between warm and cold texting? You can put it in the chat. Anyone? Okay, I see something. Nope. Okay, so we're going to talk about it. So warm texting is when you are texting an audience who are familiar with your organization or campaign. These are folks who are warmed up to your organization. I know you. They support you. These are most likely your supporters, donors, volunteers, right? So these are folks who are most likely to want to receive messages from you, right? Another key thing about warm texting, and you can warm text without an opt-in, but most warm texting is done with an opt-in. So you receive consent to text those individuals, which makes it even warmer, right? Now, with cold texting, and this is what a lot of folks do for peer-to-peer texting, you don't have a relationship with the people you're texting. It's like you heard the term cold calling, right? So in this case, again, you're cold texting. So you're texting a list who is the opposite of warm, right? Unfamiliar with your organization or campaign and did not give you permission to text them. So these are your voters. When it comes to census texting that we did last year, those are the folks who are trying to reach, who are hard to reach, hard to count folks. So you're texting someone who just doesn't know who you are and might not be as susceptible to your texting. So we do see higher opt-outs with cold texting for that reason. Okay. Now, really quick, peer-to-peer versus broadcast. Now, a lot of folks tend to not understand that there are two different types of texting and what those differences are. Now, this has gotten a little more muddy with 10DLC, but really quick, and feel free to screenshot this. The key difference between peer-to-peer and broadcast, right, is that the way you're sending the message. So for peer-to-peer, you're typically using a 10-digit number, so either toll-free or a 10DLC, and you literally have to press send on every message. Whereas with broadcast, I can queue up a message, press send, and that will go out to any number of folks at once. So for broadcast, I can send one message out to thousands or millions of people in one motion, right? Just press send, like an email platform, right? Whereas, and the reason why we do peer-to-peer texting is a couple things. The first and predominant reason is because opt-ins are not typically mandatory for peer-to-peer texting. So you do not need to get that consent to text that person legally, which is why we tend to use it to text voters, right? Whereas broadcast, to use the system that sends it automatically to all those folks at once, you do need to collect their consent and their opt-in. And so that is why it's very similar to an email program, right? When we do emails, we usually require that we received opt-ins, though some people don't follow that rule, right? But there are fines involved if you do broadcast texting without an opt-in. Now, for peer-to-peer, you obviously need a lot of volunteers, and you also need a bunch of staff to train those volunteers to send those messages, or you need staff who have the time. Whereas broadcast, you can have one person trained to do it, and you could have a backup. Right now, peer-to-peer and broadcasts typically are on par in terms of cost, depending on the platform. And with broadcast, there's a lot more functionality typically associated with a lot of these platforms, though not all. Whereas peer-to-peer is more simplified texting. And again, like I said, this has changed a lot given everything that's been going on with 10DLC. So broadcast, you can actually now use with a long code, which you couldn't before. You could also use it with toll-free, as well as shortcode. And there are some other things that we're going to get into. Okay, before I move on to compliance, are there any questions? Any questions before I move on? Okay, hearing none, I'm going to move on. And it looks like we are almost a quarter through, so I'm going to have to go much quicker. Okay, so compliance. First of all, you need to understand the entities that you are trying to comply to. So first of all, you have the government side. And there is an act that was passed in 1991 called the Telephone Consumer Protection Act, shortened TCPA. And this is the enforcement legislation that basically says what you can and cannot do when it comes to phone calls, SMS, text, and fax, and what the restrictions are in terms of telemarketing, etc. And the agency that oversees this is the FCC, right? The Federal Communications Commission. Now, the FCC can fine you for any violations of the TCPA, and they usually will fine you if there is a complaint that is enacted. And you'll usually go through a hearing process, sometimes even through the courts or through an FCC hearing for those. There actually are several in place right now against multiple Republican organizations that were started back in March. Next, we have the CTIA, which is the trade association that represents all the carriers. They're basically the voice of, T-Mobile, AT&T, Verizon, US Cellular. All of those carriers have this one representative that speaks for them. Now, there are also new bodies that are under the CTIA that we're going to talk about. One is called the Campaign Registry. And the CTIA basically sets up their own rules that some which echo the TCPA and others which will which are slightly different or more difficult to adhere to. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that. The key thing to note, and this is changing, but basically the FCC can fine you and the CTIA can block your messages. Those are the two key differences. Now, some things are changing. The carriers are going to start actually fining you as well. And we're going to talk a little bit about that. So the key thing to note about the government side are these three key rulings. So back in the summer of 2020, there was a ruling by the FCC that declared that peer-to-peer texting platforms that we currently use are not considered what they call an ATDS, or automatic telephone dialing system. And because of that, they have determined that peer-to-peer texting isn't required to comply with the FCC and TCPA. What this means is you don't have to get an opt-in, which is why, again, we can use peer-to-peer to text without an opt-in without worrying about being fined by the government. Now, a newer decision that came out this spring was against Facebook. And in that decision, they decided that the definition of an automatic telephone dialing system is specifically what they considered that system in 1991, which means you can't technically apply it to the newer systems we have now in the later 2000s because it's not the same. And this is actually, throwing a wrench in a lot of the compliance stuff on the government side. But we expect new legislation to get passed in the next couple of years that will reel this in. And it also is not a sign to say, okay, we'll go wild and break all the rules. Don't do that, because again, the carriers are also enforcing stuff on the other side. Now, the reason why the carriers can enforce a lot of the fees and restrictions that they're placing on texting is because of a decision by the FCC in 2018. In 2018, they decided to classify our text messaging as information services instead of telecommunication services. Now, if texting had been defined as telecommunication services, then carriers would not be able to filter messages, block messages, or do anything of the sort that they do now. Whereas because it is defined as information services, they are given more power to be able to filter, control, and restrict text messaging that go through to their customers and through their systems. So that was the government. Now let's talk about the CTIA. They had really strong restrictions for shortcode texting, but they didn't really have as many restrictions when it came to texting via toll-free or long codes. But 2020 and 2019 changed that. So in the fall of 2020, the CTIA released a statement saying that they are going to be cracking down on folks that don't receive consent to text, don't have clear opt-out or stop language in all their outgoing texts, use public URL shorteners like bit.ly, and also those that do what is called snowshoeing. That's what we do with peer-to-peer texting, basically. It's when we use multiple phone numbers to get out more messages to different audiences to rotate them through. Now, originally, snowshoeing was blocked as a use for broadcast texting. So sending, a broadcast text to 100 people and then another 100 people and then another 100 people through an automated system. But now peer-to-peer is kind of falling under that as well. So they've decided basically that they're going to be blocking or filtering messages that get complaints around these types of issues.
Sandy,
now,
that
a
is
really
20
key
minutes.
thing to note. Okay, we're at 20. Thank you. A really key thing to note is that the FCC and the CTIA and us, we all use different terms or similar wording to define different things. So we talked about the FCC and the TCPA, and basically how they look at things, again, is how the messages are being sent. whether or not it's being sent through an automatic telephone dialing system or not. If it is, it falls under the TCPA. So we applied our definitions based on that. So broadcast is considered an automatic telephone dialing system, whereas P2P is not. And that's how we separate out our terminology. And it's basically how we're sending the message, whereas the carriers define it differently. They don't define it by how the message is being sent. They define it by who the message is being sent to. So when you ask a carrier about P2P messaging, they refer to P2P messaging as sending to an individual. So sending via a peer-to-peer is me sending a message to my friend. So not sending more than 100 messages, other types of restrictions. And it's not an entity sending it, it's an individual sending those messages, right? Whereas A2P messaging is any organization or corporate entity. So it could be nonprofit, campaign, corporation, any entity sending messages to a set of individuals is considered A2P texting, application to person. So that is one of the key things that we have been dealing with when we are talking with the carriers around 10DLC and how we text versus how they view our texting. Okay, I'm going to stop there really quick and ask if anyone has any questions. What is patch through calling? So patch through calling is allowing a person to actually be connected to another number. So they might dial a number and then that number will connect them. So we use patch through calling for like click to calls, right? So if you want to call Congress, so we'll tell people to call into this one number and then we'll, ask for their zip code, or we might already know it. And based on that, we'll connect them to their congressperson. So that's what patch through calling is. It's calling to one number to be then siphoned out to other numbers. Okay. Any other questions? Can you clarify P2P versus A2P again? I want to confirm I understand. Hustling through an organization to individuals, is that A2P or P2P? So again, this is how the carriers define it. The carriers view any organization sending messages to an individual as A2P. So if you are sending a peer-to-peer message through Hustle for your organization, so the message is coming from the SEIU or from Indivisible, right? And it's going to an individual, they would consider that an A2P message. That is how the carriers define it. Even though the way our industry defines it is as peer-to-peer. Does that make sense? I know it's incredibly confusing. If you want, I can just bring back that chart and feel free to screenshot that. And then here is how the carriers define consumer versus non-consumer. Okay, again, unlike the CTIA and us who define these two things via the type of mechanism used to send it, they define it based on the audience receiving the messages and sending the messages. So again, consumer, we're talking about literally you just messaging your friends, right? P2P. And non-consumer, anything where an entity is sending the messages is A2P. And part of their rules with this say specifically that express or written consent is required depending on the use case. Now, we're working on ensuring that we can still text using our peer-to-peer texting without an opt-in. And I'll talk a little bit about that because that's a little up in the air still. So let's talk about 10DLC. So as we mentioned before, 10DLC stands for 10-digit long code. And the reason it was starting to get implemented in 2021 by T-Mobile and AT&T is because of accountability. They wanted to be able to know who was sending messages from these local phone numbers, to be able to, hold them accountable and find them, or block messages or turn off the numbers if someone is a bad actor, meaning they're not actually opting people out, or they're sending spam text, all the scam texts that people have been receiving, phishing schemes, things like that, right? So those are the primary folks that they were targeting, but also, we also did a ton of texting in 2020 that led to some complaints as well. Now, they consider, again, 10DLC to be A2P texting, because even though it's coming from a long code and we might be using a platform that allows us to send each message individually, which we call a peer-to-peer platform, right? It's still considered application to person texting. So with 10DLC, what they're doing is they're requiring organizations to register under what they call a brand. And then campaigns not only have to register, but they also have to be verified by an organization called Campaign Verify. Now, the key thing to note is that this type of 10DLC that we are talking about right here is only being enforced by T-Mobile and AT&T. Verizon released their own form of 10DLC requirements back in 2020, and they did not put any restrictions on it. As you all may remember, everyone was able to text as they had been since 2016 and 2020 to Verizon numbers without any changes. So that is a key thing to note. This is really only T-Mobile and AT&T, though that could potentially change. Now, again, the registering entity is a separate organization that was created by the CTIA, T-Mobile, and AT&T to register folks and be the monitoring agency, basically, or organization. And part of that registration process, for some, requires proof of opt-ins. Some don't. It's very confusing, and it's been changed a couple times now. So, and we're still having conversations about whether or not political and nonprofit organizations can get away with texting without an opt-in when it comes to, as long as they are actually adhering to the CTIA rules, right? So it's a little bit more up in the air, and I'll give some advice later about that. Now, all campaigns must go through Campaign Verify. So if you are a local campaign, state, federal, or if you are a 527 or PAC, you must register with Campaign Verify first. You'll get what's called a token, and then you can then register with the campaign registry with that token. So the way the campaign registry looks at the ecosystem in terms of organizations involved in sending messages from a long code is this. And it's very technical, and I apologize for that. But basically, first, again, you register your brand, and then under brands, your brand is your organization. And under your brand, you'll have multiple messaging campaigns. So you're going to do GOTB. You're going to go do a fundraising campaign. You're going to do, an advocacy campaign. These are all different campaigns under your brand. Then you've got your CSP, which is your campaign service provider. This can be a combination of things, but mostly it's usually the texting platforms you are using. So this is your Hustle. This is your Spoke, whoever's administering your Spoke instance. This is a wide range of different things, right? But they're mostly whoever's allowing you to send the messages. Then there's the DCA, which is the Direct Connect Aggregator. These are the folks like Twilio or SignalWire or Bandwidth, the ones who actually give the messages to the provider to be able to send them out to the carriers. Some DCAs are both a CSP and a DCA. And to register for the campaign registry, a lot of the CSPs and DCAs, meaning your platforms and aggregators, are actually doing it for you and working with you through their own networks. So, for instance, Hustle might have sent you a form to fill out so that you could register for the campaign registry to have your numbers to text. Okay, so a lot of them are helping you do this process. Most of them are doing definitely the campaign registry. Some are even helping getting you verified through Campaign Verify if you're a political organization. So those are usually being done through your provider, right? Through the platform or the aggregator that you are working with. And then those messages are sent to the MNO, which is the carriers, right? And then the end user is whoever's receiving the messages. So what happens when I register? First of all, you register your brand. And you're charged a one-time fee of $4 to register your brand. Keep in mind, your brand should be your organization, okay? So you would need to register if you have a C3 and a C4, register them separately. Similarly, if you have a PAC, register that separately if they're going to be doing texting. Then you get to choose 1 to 5 use cases that your brand is most likely to use. Now, I'm going to go over some of the more detailed, but basically you'll have your standard use cases and then you have special use cases, which fall under political and special services like charities. Now, if again, you are a political campaign or political entity like a party, a PAC, etc., you need to go to Campaign Verified. Now, I know I put this as number 3, but that's because it doesn't apply to everyone. You should probably be starting the Campaign Verify process at the same time or before you start your brand registration. Now, once your brand is approved with your Campaign Verify token, if you're a campaign or not, you're given a verification score. Now, with special use cases, the score tends not to be important, but if you apply for any standard use cases, it will, because that score will determine what your throughput is, or how many messages per minute you can send, and for T-Mobile, how many messages per day or per month you're allowed to send. So that's really important. And if you don't like the verification score that you receive, you can appeal it and pay a $40 fee to have that reconsidered. Then, once you have your brand fully registered, you can then register your campaigns. Now, depending on the campaign and your brand type, so if you're political or anything else, it'll be $10 per month for that campaign. So if the campaign is only a month, you'll only pay $10. If the campaign is going for 3 months, you'll pay $30. And for charities, that fee is $5. But there is talk about having that waived completely. So again, everything is still a conversation and things are still very much in flux. There was supposed to be a new T-Mobile fee. Again, this only applies for T-Mobile, but every campaign you registered would also have a $50 fee. So if, again, you're doing a 1-month campaign, you're paying the $10 fee plus the $50 fee, which is $60, or you're paying the $50 fee plus 30 if it's a 3-month campaign, so you're paying $80. Now, that fee launch was postponed. It was supposed to be launched October 1st, and they have not given a new date for when that will happen. The other fees associated if you don't register, so hold on, go back. so if you do register, these are the fees that you'll pay, right? So you'll notice that for T-Mobile and AT&T, they're comparable but not exactly the same. These are fees on top of the per message fee. So if you're paying 1 cent a message, that 0.002 cents is going to be tacked onto it. Now, if you don't register, what's called a network access fee will be increased. So that fee will be higher if you're not registered. And of course, you run the risk of potentially your messages being filtered and blocked. So we talked about use cases before, and this is really important because this is going to affect how you can send messages and how likely those messages are going to go through. So the key thing is the charity use case. You must be a registered 501c3 nonprofit to qualify for this. And during the early vetting, when you register your brand, they're going to ask you for your EIN number to verify that you are a 501c3 nonprofit. Emergency services, similarly, is an area that is primarily used by 501c3 and government entities. So those get special approval. Political for nonprofits is for 501c4, 5, and 6. Also, 527s can be applied here. And basically, it's any texting you're doing to influence a decision-making group. That could be voters, that could be elected officials, right? Then there is the political use case specifically for those with a campaign verified token. Again, this is federal, state, local, political parties, PACs, and sometimes 527s. Okay. Social, this is mostly for public figures. And you have to get external vetting, which can run between $40 and $500, depending on which external vetting you use. But this could be used by elected officials or celebrities, etc. There is also a standard use case for higher education and a new special use case for K to 12 education. So any messaging for school-related and education-related activities will fall under those. There's also a standard use case called mixed messaging and marketing. Now, mixed messaging has the lowest throughput, and I highly advise not doing that. Marketing is also standard. Most of you are going to be applying under charity and political. Those are the primary use cases you will most likely be using. Now, I talked about a little bit about SCORE before. Again, these only apply to those standard use cases. So mixed marketing, as well as a few others. But again, most of you won't be under this, but you'll get a score. And that score will determine how many messages you can send per day and per minute and per second. So you'll note here that if you get a score, under 85 or under 75, you're only going to be able to send 10 messages a second or 600 messages a minute, or even less if you have a lower score. Most of you are going to be under these special use cases in yellow down at the bottom. Now, as you can see, charity use cases don't have the best throughput, which is why we suggest that you actually apply for include a political use case as well, potentially, as well, or a social use case. So that's something to consider when you are applying for your campaign use cases.
Sandy, that is 40 minutes.
Thank you. Okay. It's good that I'm wrapping this section up. Lastly, we talked a little about snowshoeing before, and most of our peer-to-peer campaigns use more than 50 numbers because we're targeting a very large audience, and we need to rotate through those numbers to be able to consistently send messages. There are requirements, and this is from T-Mobile only, that you get special permission and pre-approval to use 50 or more numbers and to send more than 200 messages a day. So if you are doing a very large scale campaign that is sending more than 200 messages a day and will use 50 or more numbers, you will need to get special permission from T-Mobile to be able to do so. Now, there will be a fee assessed, but they have not told us when that will be officially pushed through, and that would be $5,000. It's pricey. Which sucks. We're working on getting that waived, ideally, or not even implemented. But for now, just know that you do need special approval to send messages with more numbers and higher throughput. And if you don't register, I mentioned this before, basically you will have higher network messaging fees. The fees will basically double, so it'll cost more. There is the potential of fines, which again have not fully been implemented yet, but are being, shared as something that will be implemented. And there is a chance of heavy message filtering. Now, from what I've been told, they don't have the mechanisms yet to filter 10DLC versus non-registered traffic. So this is kind of like a false flag threat right now. That could change. So they won't really necessarily be able to block your messages as long as you are, being careful about your deliverability in general and, not using any tactics that could be flagged as spam. And we're going to talk about deliverability in a bit. So important dates, right? Technically, AT&T already launched, T-Mobile already launched, but they have postponed certain fee implementation. And there is still technically a grace period with the campaign registry that they have extended until November 1st. So you still have time to register. So my recommendation is, number one, just register any upcoming peer-to-peer outreach campaigns if you can. If you have a really short timeline, you have an election right now, don't bother. Just text as you normally would, because the timeline is not going to work for you. But if you have something coming up in the next year or in December, you can start that registration process now. Mainly, like I said before, right now, continue texting as normal. It's basically like 2020. You just have to be very aware when you're peer-to-peer texting of ensuring that your deliverability is in place when it comes to the content you're using and how you're texting. The other thing I recommend is, if you can, develop a test to see how 10DLC is being applied. So run with two lists, send the same message campaign, use one on a registered number if you're allowed to, and one on a non-registered number. See if your aggregator or your provider will let you do this. And if you do, let me know, because I would love to see if there are differences in deliverability at all. So I highly recommend that. We're also doing a lot of lobbying right now, and feel free to get involved in there are tons of groups that are doing lobbying for progressive civic organizations. There's the political organizations, the AAPC, Association of Political Consultants, is lobbying really to ensure that political and nonprofit messaging is understood and is not held to some of these ridiculous standards that are being put out. And lastly, start investing in an opt-in program, because then you don't have to really deal with a lot of the concerns around opt-ins. And honestly, it's pretty easy to get folks opted in if you're warm texting. So if you're using peer-to-peer to send warm text to volunteers, or supporters, donors, etc., those are your easy opt-ins. And it could just save you a lot of hassle and frustration by doing an opt-in program. Okay, let's talk about deliverability. So what is deliverability, right? Number one, it's basically the number of messages received compared to the number of messages sent. So if, hopefully most of your messages are going through, but there is a good chance that a certain percentage are not. So your goal is to get ideally over 90% deliverability. Now, these on the right are examples of some campaigns that were run in 2017 to varied size lists. And you can see that depending on the carrier, there are very varied delivery rates. Now, the thing to understand about text message delivery is how the message gets from you to your audience, right? So first of all, we have our texting platforms known as CSPs that we talked about before, right? These are Upland, Strive, Easy Texting, Hustle, Spoke, ThroughText, etc., right? All peer-to-peer and broadcast platforms are your CSPs. That platform will then send the message to the aggregator or cloud providers, Twilio, who will then send it out to another entity that divvies it up between the different carriers. Once it gets to the different carriers, depending on the type of sending mechanism, again, whether it's 10DLC, shortcode, toll-free, or what they consider peer-to-peer, right? Me just texting my friend, it'll go down a different path to get to your end user, the person you're trying to reach. And you'll note I have like little blocks in place. Those are filters that might block your message from going to your end user. Now, why do wireless carriers have filtering systems? Think of it as a highway, right? They want to make sure that whoever's receiving those messages is getting the messages they want to receive. Now, one of the most known filtering systems that are applied are spam filters, right? They're very similar to email spam filters in that they're an algorithm and it's constantly changing. The difference, though, is with email, it ends up in a spam inbox, right? You can still go check to see those messages. Oh, it ended up in my spam. Oops, right? With spam filters on texting, they're actually just blocked. Your messages don't go through. They don't go in some inbox anywhere. They are simply blocked from going by. Think of it as a highway, right? So you have your short code, your long code, and your toll-free. On the short code highway, there are no spam filters at all. You just go straight ahead. It's the carpool lane, right? On the toll-free, you have a spam filter in place. And on 10DLC, you have a spam filter in place, right? That are going to make sure that the messages sent are not considered spam. And if complaints are sent, they also get looked at and blocked. Okay. And again, every carrier's algorithm is different. So, and they're constantly changing. So your message might go through to Verizon, but not to T-Mobile. And your next message might not go through to T-Mobile and AT&T, but go through to Verizon, et cetera, et cetera.
Sandy, there's
sorry, how many minutes? 10?
10 minutes left.
Okay, thank you. Now, originally A2P filters, which again are if you are sending a broadcast message down the long code lane, there was another filter in place. Now, this applies to that P2P highway lane that exists now. So if you try to send a message out to thousands of people at once, it'll be blocked before it even hits the spam filter because you're trying to send a ton of messages to through the peer-to-peer highway. Okay. So you're probably wondering, how do I know if my messages are being filtered? You get a delivery rate, but you don't know like why they're being stopped, right? So first of all, you don't really know, and it gets a little complicated. So first off, you can get from aggregators or your provider error codes. You can see what the error codes are. When they're sent back, it might be because it has a link, or it might be marked as spam, or it might be marked as something else. There's multiple error codes. Also, if it's a disconnected number, it'll get blocked, right? That's another error code. If you sent multiple texts that look exactly the same and it's flagged, that can be marked as well. But here's the fun thing. Sometimes carriers lie. So they'll throw back the incorrect error code just to trick you so you can't figure out their algorithm. So it's tricky. Now, we did a couple case studies in 2020 with a colleague of mine, where he analyzed all the error code data for the GOTV as well as census-related texting that was done for 2 programs. One was the State Voices GOTV and Indivisible GOTV, and then the other was the census texting that was done. And one of the key things that we found was that there was a higher rejection of initial messages when they were at peak volume within a 30-minute period. So the best advice I can give you is to spread out your messaging and don't try to message too much in a short period of time, because that does trigger a lot of their filters. The other key thing is domains. We talked about public domains being something they say they're going to flag. But what we found is they still rejected messages that had private domain links. So it's really good to test. If you have a big list, try to do some testing with different full URLs or trackable private URLs. While more bit.lys were rejected, the percent of bit.lys compared to the percent of private URLs didn't add up. There wasn't any real proof, for instance, that they were basically blocking more public domains. So that's what they tell us, again, versus what we're actually seeing in the data. And this is in 2020. For all I know, in 2021, this could have changed. So I still advise you use a private domain, but just keep in mind your messages still could get blocked as spam for having a link. So how do I improve message deliverability? First of all, provide a good user experience. Always identify your organization, the sending organization, okay? And when I say provide a good user experience, I mean basically making sure that the audience you're receiving there's a cost benefit for them, right? Like they are actually getting something out of the message, be it, their voting location or a reminder to do something important, right? Or emergency text about something, right? Or, a free ticket to a show. I don't know, something that they're going to want to get a text from you about. Again, keeping in mind how the message is formatted and written is important. We highly recommend variations. So if your platform lets you have variations of the same text to rotate through, do that. And how it's written is important. They'll more likely flag capitalizations and things like that. No public short URLs. Again, this has been tested and it's iffy, but I would still weigh against it. Like I said before, variations in the content, providing clear opt-out instructions. Now, this has been tested and it varies. There were higher opt-outs when you included the language, and there wasn't necessarily a decrease in deliverability when we didn't include the language. There is a chance you could get fined by the carrier or possibly by the FCC. It's so up in the air right now. My suggestion is to test it. But I'm more in favor of including it just because it's a better practice. You don't want people really pissed at you. They're more likely to complain, and then your messages are more likely to get blocked. And And then again, for ATP traffic and registering your long code toll-free or short code. So go through that process, get it fully registered, and that'll clear the way for you a little bit more in terms of deliverability. And lastly, monitor. Constantly monitor. Things change. If you see a certain thing not working, switch it out, change the text a bit, or switch out a URL. If you see, or just stop the campaign and then relaunch it in a little bit later. But yeah, monitoring is really important. So if you see like only 50% of your messages are going through, stop your campaign and reassess. So I don't have time to cover the opt-in requirements. Keep in mind, of course, right now, as it stands, it's a question mark when it comes to peer-to-peer texting for 10DLC and some toll-free, but opt-ins are required for broadcast texting. And there are a lot of bad actors in the space, namely one you're familiar with, but also some Democrats. So this is Juliana Castro, who did not opt someone out after they typed in stop. So again, they are watching. There are, the carriers are, not happy about a lot of these bad actors, and they're taking it out on us. So be a good actor as much as you can. Let's go through all this and get to questions. So yeah, I'm ready for questions. So if you have any. Okay. Let's see, I'm scrolling through. So Bina said, FYI for others, while registering with TCP as a brand and setting up our messaging campaigns, there's no choice for unions to classify themselves. Yes. You are basically, you're registered, you're a nonprofit. You're not a 501c3 charity, but you are a nonprofit. So that is again, correct. So 501c4s, 501c5 and 6, same thing. I registered your union as mixed messaging. Don't do it. Register your union as political. Go back and change it, Bina. A question. You may be about to say this, but are we typically know which carrier numbers have? Wait. Oh, so all the numbers are not associated with a carrier, right? So then, oh, you mean the numbers you're targeting? Okay, so you should be able to have that information and know, if you got, for instance, your numbers from like Van through a data vendor, they should be able to tell you how many of your numbers are Verizon, how many are T-Mobile, etc. So that is information if you don't have, you can get. I think I'm going to be providing the slideshow. Also, I believe this is recorded, so you should be able to get the recording too, and rewatch it or show it to your colleagues. And I do these trainings a lot, so hopefully another colleague can jump on another one. Thanks, Jamie. I'm glad you enjoyed the presentation. Anybody else? Any other questions? Also, my email is up on the screen. Feel free to tweet how great this presentation was. That's my handle on there. So feel free to reach out to me if you have questions about your own program and how you can be compliant or ways to improve it. Happy to help. And yeah, I think that's it. I think it's time. So thank you all for joining, and enjoy the rest of Netroots.